Well, good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Dean Freelon, and I am an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. This presentation is one that I've given a number of times, and I do not apologize for the fact that this recording is a rather generic one that gives this presentation without reference to who is necessarily going to be presenting it. So all that introductory stuff I consider to be rather ancillary anyway. So you can console yourself with the fact that this presentation is about 98% of what you would get if I was presenting it live. So that having been said, let me go ahead and fire up my, okay, no, now I gotta do something else first, which is share my screen. Like this. Then I gotta fire this thing up. Okay, there's my title screen. Excellent, alrighty. So this presentation is called #Heroes versus Disinformation Dystopia, the left, the right, and the truth about social media activism. And this presentation, it chronicles a paper that was published in Science about a year ago. I'm still talking about it because I think it's still relevant, and obviously a lot of what I'm going to have to say has been updated since the paper was published. This was shortly before the US 2020 election. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed. Without making too many assumptions about what you do or don't know about digital and social media activism, I will observe that it is or has been an active research area for over 2 decades across many, many disciplines. There have been countless studies on this, qualitative and quantitative. Popular and scholarly interest remains strong. Computational social science, which is one of my specialties, has become increasingly important as much of this work, in terms of movement work, has become visible through social media platforms and activity. So last year, at around this time, some colleagues of mine, Alice Mark and Daniel Kreis, also researchers at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, released a review in Science magazine. This review is called False Equivalencies: Online Activism from Left to Right. And in this review, we do a couple of things. Actually, we do 3 things. I'm going to talk about the first thing in brief, just because I want to mention it. And then the latter 2 things are going to take up the majority of this presentation. And, I'm very interested in any feedback or questions you may have about our findings, a year out, right? So how effectively or how well do our observations hold up, 1 year later after they were published? So the first thing that we do in the paper is we talk about a phenomenon with which some of you may be familiar, called clicktivism, also known as slacktivism. This is the idea that online engagement substitutes for real offline engagement. I say quote unquote real offline engagement. The academic literature furnishes almost no evidence of this. Instead, online engagement tends to support offline engagement. In other words, when someone is interested in politics, they tend to engage with it both online and offline. And when people are not interested in politics, they tend to engage with it neither online nor offline. There is some evidence, some preliminary evidence, that clicktivism, or what is called clicktivism, may serve as a gateway for offline activity in some cases. But this is an area for future research that folks should really investigate, because that's very interesting. It would really bolster the case for online activism and engagement if it does in fact lead to more costly offline or even online engagement. Most research looks at political engagement in what we call an undifferentiated way. So they'll ask, for example, questions about things like voting, signing petitions, campaign volunteering in general, without reference to specific issues in most cases. These studies don't tend to explore how people's level of commitment to specific issues might affect their willingness to engage in high versus low effort activism, which again is a very fertile area for future research. And I think that's probably still the case 1 year out. Another question that we ask, and this is actually central to one of the key insights of the piece, this question of whether collectivism works differently for the right vis-a-vis the left. Is it a more effective gateway tactic for one versus the other? I don't know. We don't. Maybe there's research that y'all are aware of. If you know about this, please let me know. Again, lots of research to be done in this area, but this really ties into the core theme of this particular presentation, which is something known as ideological asymmetries. For those who have not heard of this term, it refers to systematic differences in left-right beliefs and behaviors. This is demonstrated in some of the following findings that are bulleted on this slide, which are that conservatives tend to trust mainstream news less. Conservatives have a stronger preference for ideological echo chambers. Conservatives share more false news, and conservatives tolerate politicians spreading disinformation more than non-conservatives. And so all of these findings represent ideological asymmetries in which, in this case, the right does something more or less than the left. This has been consistently demonstrated across a wide range of studies. And this brings us to the core dichotomy that animates this presentation, to wit, #heroes versus disinformation dystopia. Now, if you'll direct your attention to the left side of this slide, you'll see a visual representation of what I mean by #heroes. If you look closely at the pound sign emblazoned on this square, you'll see a number of hashtags. And if you look closely at what these hashtags are, you'll see that all of them are left-leaning in nature, everything from she persisted, intersectional feminism, feel the burn, resistance, no DAPL, me too, Black Girls Rock, so on and so forth. And this really visually symbolizes the fact that in most cases, when we're talking about #activism, we are talking about two things. First of all, we're talking about something that is predominantly, or at least the empirical received wisdom is that #activism is predominantly a tactic of the left. So that's the first thing we're talking about. Now, this might be true or false, but most of the research tells us that because most of the research is on #activism that is perpetrated by the left. Secondly, there is an aspect of normative goodness to this, right? So these heroes standing against, the evils of injustice and all of that. So there's a heavy normative cast to this. The very idea of #activism is deeply normative, and we think of it in terms of, people who are fighting the good fight. And there's not quite so much research on #activism that is negative in character, and what research there is doesn't tend to use the word #activism. Now, shifting over to the left, sorry, we're already on the left. Shifting over to the right side of the slide here, we see a visual representation of disinformation dystopia. And this, as symbolized by the position of this particular square, is considered in both the popular imagination and in the empirical record as an exclusive or the predominant domain of the right. So Fox News, you see Sean Hannity, InfoWars and the rest of them being perpetrators, again, of disinformation. And so the take-home message here is that disinformation is mostly a problem of the right. We don't necessarily know whether this is true or not, and that's something that we empirically demonstrate and point out in this paper. But based on the empirical record, at least until recently, that is what people would tend to conclude, because the vast majority of disinformation studies that look at ideology in any way do so from a perspective of looking at it as coming from the right side of the political aisle. So this particular table is a little bit out of date. And so if you want to add elements to this, I assume that at some point folks will start citing our paper and picking up on some of the recommendations that we make in it. But I think it's probably still fair to say that the vast majority of #activism research focuses on the left. The vast majority of alternative media sphere / mis and disinformation research that addresses ideology, focuses on the right, and those off diagonal squares are still probably very sparsely populated. And so this introduces a particular issue for us, which is that it may be the case that hashtag activism is an exclusive or predominant province of the left, and disinformation is the predominant province of the right, but without actually looking for left-leaning disinformation or right-leaning hashtag activism, we cannot say that that is the case for sure. And that is one of the calls that we make in our science piece, is that these off diagonals need a lot more investigation before we can make any draw any conclusive conclusions in this area. So there's really like two possibilities here. So one is that the literature as it stands reflects true ideological divisions and online activism operating strategies, as represented on the left. Secondly, on the right, there is the possibility that there is insufficient research on, firstly, right-wing hashtag activism, and secondly, left-leaning disinformation, and that in turn is generating an incomplete empirical portrayal. And then, of course, it is entirely possible that the truth may be somewhere in between. Probably is. So I do want to say something about the distinct danger of right-wing disinformation. We have observed over the course of 2021 that disinformation that appeals to the right is distinctly damaging. And so, separate and apart from any questions of quantity or quality of the disinformation between the left and right, we have seen in terms of the effects, the dangers of right-wing disinformation. We saw this on January 6th. We see this in the strongest and most prominent anti-vax and anti-mask movements here in the United States, and in other ways. And there simply is not, to my knowledge, any left-wing equivalent of the dangers that flow from this. And so it's important to keep, on the one hand, the sort of supply aspect of it being one thing, the psychological aspect of it being something else, and then the effects being a third thing. But I do want to point that out so as not to engage in any false equivalence, as our title implies, of the science piece, that is. So let's go back and talk about some possibilities here. So we do know, because these two propositions do enjoy strong and methodologically diverse empirical support, firstly, that we do know that hashtag activism is a widely used and effective mode of online activism for the left, and that the right has its own alternative media ecosystem which is, firstly, disproportionately tolerant of mis and disinformation, and secondly, closely networked with ideological leaders. We know these things are true. In my mind, these are beyond empirical dispute. It is really those off diagonals, again, that we are concerned with and that have not been studied enough to be able to draw any firm conclusions. So here we're looking at studies from the 2016 election, and these studies show higher fake news sharing and consumption on the right. And so all of this research was done before Trump was elected, or data was collected before Trump was inaugurated. And so this is pretty strong. You know, when I first started formulating the general ideas for this piece, I thought, well, you know, it could be that they're working with data that was, you know, before Trump was elected. Maybe things changed afterward. You know, maybe the left got a little bit more into disinformation because of that. You know, maybe Trump sort of dragged the entire country down with him as far as that goes. You know, it was entirely possible and something that was worth investigating. However, I am now convinced that on a quantitative level, that there is strong evidence for more right-wing disinformation, right? And so we know this from work by the Election Integrity Partnership, by the group at NYU known as Cybersecurity for Democracy, and by some of the public opinion polling that has been conducted in the wake of January 6th, showing that many Republicans, in fact, in this poll, showing 50% of Republicans believe that Antifa was mostly responsible for the violence that happened at the riots at the US Capitol, right? These are Republicans. And many other Republicans believe that it wasn't Antifa, but it actually wasn't that bad. The media is blowing it out of proportion. It was just a peaceful protest and a few people, you know, started yelling or something like that. So I think that this evidence, when you take it together, really does make a strong case that there is more on the supply side in terms of right-wing disinformation However, that doesn't mean that there's no left-wing disinformation. We don't know exactly what it is. We don't know who spreads it. We don't know who's vulnerable to it. And so we still need to engage in those studies to try to figure out what exactly is going on with left-wing disinformation and how it differs from right-wing disinformation. This is, again, an area we know too little about, and we should really find out more about it. So I want to take a bit of a detour here and take a look at a couple of case studies that really illustrate how some of the theories in this area make it a little bit difficult to focus on some of these issues that I've been discussing. And so the quote that is highlighted on the slide is taken from a book that is an excellent book called #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice. And this book is a great combination of computational methods and critical discourse analysis that I feel like should really set the standard methodologically as well as theoretically. But I do have one quibble with one of the ways that they characterize the theory of #activism. And so this excerpt is from the part of the book where they define what #activism is. And they say that #activism refers to the strategic ways counterpublic groups and their allies on Twitter employ this shortcut to make political contentions about identity politics that advocate for social change, identity redefinition, and political inclusion. So what you're seeing here is that these authors are baking in left-wing political commitments into their definition of #activism. But I don't really think that's the right way to go, because if #activism is a technique, then, analytically, we want to be able to say that the technique could be adapted by people of any ideology. So I think it's really, really important analytically to keep the technique separate from the political commitments. But here, it's combined together. And I do want to say that Jackson, Bailey, and Wells are not alone in this. Some of the definitions, historically speaking, of social movements and activism have been very much tied up with left-wing concerns being against power and this sort of thing. So it's not like they invented this. They're in quite fine company. But I do think there's some problems with that approach, as I explained. The second case is from a book that came out a couple of years ago that some of you may be familiar with, called Network Propaganda. And in this case, you can read this. It says, a population with high trust in bias confirming news and high distrust in bias disconfirming professional norms-driven media will be more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns than a population that has generally higher trust in professional journalism on average, but lower trust in any given media outlets. And so basically what you're setting the audience up for is this idea that the right will be more vulnerable to disinformation, and that implicitly shifts the focus away from left-wing propaganda and disinformation toward right-wing propaganda and disinformation. And even if you admit that its effects, that is, of right-wing disinformation, are more dangerous, understanding the other side of this, again, is really, really critical. So this example I'm going to present, again, comes from Network Propaganda. And in the book, the only example of left-wing disinformation I was able to find was a sort of whisper campaign that was ongoing over the summer of 2016. It was an allegation that Trump had raped a child, right? And so the basic argument, so this was sort of circulated on the fringes of the left, but it didn't really go anywhere. It didn't really get a whole lot of traction at the time. So the basic argument here is that claims are less relevant because they are largely ignored, left-wing claims that is, are largely ignored by mainstream news outlets, which is not the case for right-wing media, because right-wing media does happen to pick up some of the crazier stuff and circulate it, as we've discussed. However, one of the things I want to point out here is that disinformation may have other effects that are unrelated to mainstream news engagement. So in other words, right, we live in the 21st century, we have many information and content distribution mechanisms, so you can't say that just because the mainstream media doesn't engage with it, that it is therefore irrelevant or not worth studying. And so I give an example of this from my own unpublished or lightly published research. We talk about this a bit in the science review, but don't do a full analysis. On May 30th, 2020, over a year ago, Anonymous released a cache of documents purporting to prove that Trump was involved in child sex trafficking. In other words, the exact same rumor yet to be substantiated that was circulated in the summer of 2016, almost exactly 4 years later. Again, entirely ignored by mainstream media sites. But I documented that the story picked up 1.1 million retweets within 3 to 4 days. Now, we don't know exactly who is sharing this content. We don't know how the content fits in with the rest of their media diets. And we don't know what the similarities and differences are to right-wing disinformation sharing. But I think that the mere existence of this distribution pattern merits further inquiry. So if you look at this, this is a very quick analysis that I did after capturing this data. This is the top 20 most retweeted users mentioning Anonymous and Trump between May 31st and June 3rd, 2020. As you can see, You're Non-Central, which is the unofficial main Twitter account of Anonymous, is the #1 with over 120,000 retweets. And a bunch of these other ones, you probably don't recognize any of them because they're not prominent political accounts. Many of them are primarily engaged with K-pop and anime. And so that raises the question of whether Anonymous is reaching people politically that do not engage with other forms of traditional political and journalistic content, in which case they would likely be more likely to have a stronger influence because they don't have that counterbalancing content to go against it. Again, interesting questions, worthy of further study. I did not pick this up as a study that I'm working on, but somebody should definitely do that. This is another evidence that there may be more left-wing disinformation than we currently understand. So this is analysis again from September 2016, BuzzFeed analysis. They looked at 6 different Facebook pages, 3 left-wing, 3 right-wing. They call them hyperpartisan pages. Addicting Info, Occupy Democrats, and the other 98% being left-wing. Eagle Rising, Freedom Daily, and Right-Wing News being right-wing. Now, one thing you're going to want to do is pay attention to the fact that the y-axes are differently labeled here, only going up to 5,000 for the right, going up to 20,000 for the left. And so even with this sort of, informal analysis, you can see that Occupy Democrats and the other 98% both have more mostly false and mix of true and false content than either Freedom Daily or Right-Wing News. And so again, we're seeing this false content spreading in these left-wing spaces, but we don't exactly know what it is. We don't know who is affected by this. And so this again warrants further study. Here's another example. This came from an article that was written in the Columbia Journalism Review on Seth Abramson, who is a left-wing provocateur and crowdsourced journalist, he calls himself on Twitter. And so I think this really speaks to the notion that in some cases, left-wing disinformation might be difficult to discern because it comes in a very different form in some cases than right-wing disinformation, right? So the highlighted piece here says, Abramson, who for the most part was stringing together theories based on coverage he'd read, often turned out to be mistaken. Well, in my business, when you're often mistaken and you're not revising your epistemological assumptions and procedures to adjust for those mistakes, that runs close to reckless disregard for the truth. And so the CJR article does not refer to Seth Abramson as a disinformation agent, but certainly the practices that are outlined in this article come a little bit too close to disinformation for my particular tastes. So I think on the basis of what I've been talking about so far, there's little doubt that there's at least some left-wing disinformation out there. We don't know nearly as much about it as right-wing disinformation. Once again, more rigorous work should be done going forward. I also want to point out that even null results are valuable. So if you look for something and you don't find it, that's a really important finding. And we need to be able to put that out there and say that this is what the reality is. And so that we can do a fair comparison, which we don't really have the basis to do at the present. This is a little bit of this is a sample of something I'm working on. I'm hoping that this particular software program that's going to generate images like these will help with this issue. So basically what this is what I call a filter map. And what it does is it arrays different actors on 2 dimensions. Left, right is the left-right political dimension. And then the vertical dimension is high information quality, low information quality or credibility. And so what you want to do is you can have content that is from a wide spectrum, politically speaking, but you want everything to be mostly truthful, which would be above the x-axis. And so I'm currently working on a project that will help people develop these based on their own Twitter feeds. And so when that's released, I'm hoping to be able to capture that data as well as help people understand and visualize their particular Twitter feeds and adjust those to minimize the amount of content that falls below the zero axis here. This is just a mock-up. This is like a, it's not actual data, but it just, it's demonstrating what it's supposed to look like or what it will look like when it's done. Also want to get into questions of hashtag activism on the right. If hashtag activism is a set of tactics, which I believe is the right way to conceptualize it, it should theoretically be applicable by individuals outside the left. There's little research on how often this is attempted on the right, let alone success rates. However, anecdotal evidence suggests that something resembling hashtag activism does indeed exist, at least in small measures, on the right. So if you recognize any of these hashtags, you'll know that these are all right-wing hashtags. They're all about boycotts. And all of these were popular during the Trump administration when Trump supporters were trying to boycott various companies for doing things that they didn't like or that they considered to be anti-Trump. And so the form of this appears very similar to me to some of the left-wing hashtag activism campaigns that have been really well studied, like Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And so I think it is really important to understand the extent to which these are conceptually the same thing, or whether they just look like the same thing and they should be conceptualized differently. But again, the theoretical work has not really been done there. Right, so rigorous research here should ask, what are the similarities and differences between these right-wing and left-wing hashtags? Who's behind them, right? Is it grassroots? Is it, AstroTurf? Who's doing this? What are the effects? Do people actually engage in these boycotts, or are they just kind of posturing and saying that they're going to do these things? Are they people who weren't buying the products in the first place? What is the news media / political elite response, right? So are elected officials taking up the cause? Do the actual companies respond, or other organizations? And these are some of the questions that research in this area should really ask. There's been some existing research a little bit. There was one study that came out in 2018 that looked at R the Donald on Reddit as a political trolling community that engaged in hashtag activism-like activities, including hashtag boycott Netflix and draft our daughters. And then there was another study last year that examined boycott Starbucks and boycott Budweiser. This was from a corporate social responsibility, corporate social activism perspective, not a political perspective. And so at a minimum, such activities need to be conceptualized either within or distinct from the existing hashtag activism umbrella. Certainly there needs to be reference to it because the sort of face value similarity is too strong to ignore that well-established research tradition. So what now? It's ample evidence that left-wing disinformation and right-wing hashtag activism are understudied at best. We must rectify this to gain a more complete picture of the ideological asymmetries that characterize online activism. This is not false balance. I really want to point that out. If, for example, that disinformation turns out to be predominantly a right-wing phenomenon, so be it, but we have to put in the work to figure out whether that is true or not. The normative implications of the hashtag heroes disinformation dystopia divide strongly recommend that we firm up the empirical foundations on this as much as possible. So just speaking personally, it puts me in a bit of a weird position when I have to point to the opposite side of the political aisle from where I am and say, oh, that's where all the bad stuff is. That's where all the disinformation is. Now, obviously, as somebody who is an empirical researcher who lives and dies by the data, I'm duty bound to do that. But when I do that, I want to make sure that my empirical foundations are really, really solid, and they're just not right now. So I think we really need to be very careful and limited in terms of how we make proclamations about, what the character of left-wing and right-wing disinformation is, and what the character of right-wing hashtag activism is, until we get a little bit more empirical evidence in this area. So I'm going to stop there. As you can see, the citation for the piece is at the bottom. Sadly, I seem to have left off the issue volume and page numbers, but if you look up the title, you should be able to find it pretty easily. You can contact me over email or via Twitter if you want to talk about this more. And I will go ahead and stop my share. Thank you very much. And I will stop the recording now.